My name is Andrew. I'm 33 years old and I've been living in Idaho for the last 3 years. For transparency's sake, I didn't write up this account specifically as a submission for your channel, but after it popped into my recommended feed and I saw you taking submissions, I figured that I'd found the perfect home for the warning I'm about to give you and your viewers. Although I have no doubt that what you're about to read might frighten or disturb you, I can assure you that it's not by design. My only wish is that you and your subscribers take heed to what I'm about to say. You see, I think there's someone living off the grid up here in the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, and I know for a fact that this person is very, very dangerous. Part of the reason I moved up to Boise from my native California, aside from all the financial reasons, is that there's a total of 10 national forests within driving distance of the city. I was a Boy Scout growing up. My dad and uncles used to take my cousins and me during summer vacations, and I found a group of fellow college students to hike with when I was at UC Irvine. So when it came time to choosing a place to start a new life, Boise climbed my wish list pretty damn quickly once I realized that it combined urban amenities, a low cost of living, and the kind of natural beauty that made Southern California feel more like Manhattan than Malibu. During that first year in Idaho, I spent a lot of time hiking Boise National Forest, and the Snake River Conservation Area is right on our doorstep too. But then as time went by, I started to travel a little further afield with each trip, just to get a feel for all the different forests in the region. I drove over to Sawtooth one time, went up to Payette for a weekend, then went as far as Bitterroot Salmon Chalet, and then eventually Beaverhead Deer Lodge. I made multiple trips to each of the previously mentioned parks. I mean, you don't truly get to know a place after just 1 or 2 hikes, but I only ever made 1 trip to Beaverhead, and if I ever do get over my fear of the place, you can bet your ass I'm staying the hell away from the hills between Maverick and Stewart Mountains. And if you value your life, so should you. Now, in the southern portion of Beaverhead Forest lies the valley between Maverick and Stewart Mountains. At its westernmost point, where 2 creeks meet, the valley is open and treeless. But then travel further east and the trails taper off into what I can only describe as a capillary system of narrow trails. It kind of reminded me of one of those old hedge mazes, like the kind from The Shining, just on a much bigger scale. All the trails look pretty much identical, with wide open grass trails and pine-covered hills obscuring your view on either side. You can't really get lost these days, not if you're armed with the correct skills and equipment, but if there was ever a place I felt slightly disoriented by the lay of the land, it was there. You'd make a couple of turns, think that you were back on the main strip again, and then boom, the trail would narrow off and you'd find yourself at a dead end. I guess to a less experienced hiker, that might have been a cause for concern, but for me, it was almost nostalgic. I hadn't been even close to lost for coming up on 15 years by that point, so for me there was something almost thrilling about it. It's been years since I felt that same sense of adventure while out on a hike. I also enjoyed them, but I'd long since lost that sense of childlike awe and wonder. So to have it back, that was really something. I kept on exploring for about an hour or so, just wandering up and down the trails to try and familiarize myself with that part of the valley. Then, as I was moseying down this one particular stretch of trail, I began to smell something that smelled a lot like campfire smoke. For quite a while now, I've been in the habit of introducing myself to any fellow hikers and campers I might run into. Some might call that intrusive or even bothersome, but to me, those are big city ideas. I understand where my critics are coming from, but at the risk of sounding melodramatic, the woods aren't the kind of place that you want to go unnoticed. Part of it's just being friendly, shooting the breeze with some kindly strangers, but there's a practical side of it too. I do a lot of solo hiking, and as much as I take all the necessary precautions, I'm still much more vulnerable than most. I like folks knowing I'm there, and I like knowing just a little about who I'm sharing a trail or park with. That way, if I detect even the slightest of bad vibes, I can make myself scarce before trouble so much as toots in the wind. And so, I smell the campfire smoke, and I suspect it's coming from up the hill to my right. I wander up the slope a little, and then, lo and behold, the smell of smoke gets more and more intense the further I walk. And so off I went, following the smell like some human bloodhound until eventually the pines thinned out and I reached a kind of treeless shelf on the hillside. It was almost completely hidden from view, and just as I was thinking, this is flat enough to build on, I realized someone already had. About 50 yards away, someone had built what looked like a small 2-room cabin, complete with the beginnings of a little vegetable garden out front and a short weave fence marking the property's boundary. My first thought upon looking at it was, this can't be legal, because as much as many national parks and forests might encourage overnight campers, any kind of permanent dwelling is strictly prohibited. But at the same time, this person's dwelling was an impressive piece of work, and it obviously wasn't constructed overnight. In which case, how had he managed to stay up there for so long without getting himself into trouble with the Forest Service? All this is going through my head, and I'm just sort of staring at the little cabin in amazement, when all of a sudden, the cabin's front door swings open, and out steps a bald guy of around 40 to 50 years of age, wearing a dirty wife beater and a pair of blue jeans. Now, his cabin had a pair of windows complete with what looked to be hinged shutters, but he hadn't looked out of them before exiting his home, so the moment he sees me, I see the startled look come over his face, and he does not look pleased to see me. I figured I'd obviously gave him a bit of a jump scare, so first thing I think to do is raise a hand and wave, just to let him know that I didn't have any ill intentions. He doesn't return the wave. He just walks back into his little cabin, then emerges seconds later, armed with what appeared to be a bolt-action hunting rifle. I just want to make it clear that I did not step into this man's property, and the word property is quite purposely in quotation marks I'm writing here now. Neither was I bearing any kind of weapon or trekking pole with me when he saw me. All the guy saw was a 4-eyed, overweight dork with a floppy hat and a patchy beard, and his first move was to go grab his rifle. The second I saw it, I turned on the spot and started walking back down the hill towards the tree line. And then as I walked, I shouted back, "All right, mister, I get the message. I'm leaving." Hindsight is always 20/20, I guess, and I guess I should have just ran as fast as I could. But in the moment, I figured running would be the loudest way to announce my guilt. Run off through the trees and he'd think that I was up to no good, maybe fire off a shot at me, and that'd be all she wrote. But if I walked, hands in the air, not going for my own weapon and just trying to de-escalate, then maybe everything would just be fine. I was armed by the time, by the way. Nothing too big, just a handgun in case of bears and whatnot. But then the last thing I wanted to do was potentially start a gunfight in the middle of the woods. If I pulled out my weapon, that constituted a serious escalation, and the more this guy believed that he was in control, the less likely he was probably to shoot me. Or rather, that's what I mistakenly believed at the time. I remember giving it a second round of, "I'm going okay, I don't want any trouble." And in reply, all I heard was, "You stay right where you are." Have you seen those new Dune movies? There's a thing in it, something they call the voice. It's like a magical power. You speak and people will obey whether they want to or not. And I'm telling you, it was like that guy had the voice. He spoke and suddenly my feet were in cement blocks. I wanted to keep walking. Hell, I just wanted to run the second I saw his rifle. But whatever kept him feeling in control and his fingers off the trigger felt like my best course of action in the moment. I also literally cannot overemphasize how little I wanted to shoot this guy and turn a relaxing afternoon's hike into one of the single darkest chapters of my entire life. So, he tells me to stop, but I obviously want to face the guy as I'm talking to him, so I start to turn around. Big mistake. The guy raises his rifle, works the bolt of force around into the chamber, and then points it at me so aggressively that I could practically feel it. He was ready to fire by that point, like my life was in serious danger, but all that was going through my head as I had my arms way up in the air was like, "Please don't pee your pants. Please don't pee your pants." I didn't. And before you all go thinking, haha, what a baby, I cannot overstate how fast your mind works in those sort of situations. I was so scared I felt like I could taste the air. My arms and legs felt like they were encased in concrete, and I was sweating in places I didn't know that you could sweat from. So having all those irrational thoughts like that, not running when I had the chance, it all seems like part and parcel of all that raw, primal fear that I was feeling in the moment. Like I said, I started turning to face him, but he racked his rifle and then started yelling things like, "Did I tell you to move? Did I? Move another muscle and watch what happens." All I could think to say was all the same stuff I repeated already. Stuff about me wanting to leave, about how I just stumbled across his place and was nothing more than just curious. He looked me up and down for a second, then asked me if I was from the government. I told him no, that I was just a hiker, and in an attempt to reinforce that I wasn't some kind of fed, I told him I worked for a financial firm back in Boise, which was the truth. I told him the name of the place, my position, and then added that he could call them right then and there if he didn't believe me because the office was open on weekends. I only told him all that because he quite clearly had a problem with cops or rangers and probably just about anyone in a position of authority. That, and once I got talking, I found it unusually difficult to stop. I was still talking when he told me to shut up, and then after a few seconds of what looked like thinking, he asked me a question that had me once again questioning whether I was about to pee my pants or not. The guy lowered his rifle just a little, which was kind of reassuring, but not by much, and then he asked me, "Do you believe in God?" Make no mistake, I am not prejudiced against religious types. I had a very Baptist grandmother who volunteered with the church until just months before she passed, and she was just about as saintly of a person as it's possible to meet. Any other context, that question would have provoked anything except an honest answer. But in light of the rifle I had pointed at my stomach, I presume, it gave the question a hell of a lot of weight. On another day, I might have just spoken my mind and told him I consider myself something of an agnostic. I feel like there's something going on in terms of creation and evolution, whatever you want to call it. I just don't think we can so easily put a label like God on it and imagine him up there as this big old friendly white guy with a beard of clouds and sunny demeanor. But then, having considered my position, I decided honesty almost certainly wasn't the best policy. So instead of the truth, I lied and I told him, "Sure, I believe in God." I thought that might have gotten me out of the woods, purely metaphorically, of course, but then he asked me, "Which God?" My gut told me that saying anything apart from Protestant Christian would have probably been bad news for me, and so I went with my instinct and told him that I was Baptist, just like my grandma. When I saw him give me this little nod of approval, I felt so relieved that my knees almost buckled. But unfortunately, the guy wasn't through with me just yet. Starting and stopping as he tried to find the right words, he began to explain how only 2 people in the world knew that he was up there, and he couldn't tolerate a third. I think he must have seen the terror in my face because he went on to explain that he didn't actually want to shoot me. I guess he intended that to be reassuring, but somehow it was not, and that's the point where things turned back to why he'd asked me if I believed in God. He needed to know that I believed in something, so he could make me swear on my life that I wouldn't tell anyone I'd seen him. Right away, I told him, "I swear to God I won't tell anyone I saw you." And I did it so promptly because I very naively believed that he might actually let me walk away. But just the words alone weren't good enough for him. Holding the rifle at his hip now, the guy points it at me just a little more directly and then tells me to get on my knees. All I remember is saying please, but all that did was make him raise the gun all the way up so he could aim down the sights at me. He then repeated himself and told me to get on my knees, and from that moment, I was convinced that I was going to die, and I'm honestly not sure if I dropped to my knees deliberately or simply because they just gave out altogether. I thought that any second I'd simply go from being wide awake and terrified to just darkness. He'd blow my brains out with a single shot of that rifle and it'd switch me off like a light, you know? I literally remember thinking to myself, at least it'll be quick. But then instead of pulling the trigger, he spoke again. The guy told me to swear again, to God I mean, that I'd never tell another living soul that I'd seen him or where he was living or what we talked about. So I did. I put my hands together like I was praying, but I didn't dare close my eyes. Then I swore out loud that never in a million years would I ever tell another of God's creations about anything that had occurred that day. I don't think I said it quite like that, but you get the idea. When I was done, he just said, "Again, louder." And I did what I was told. Then once again, once I was finished, he starts yelling something like, "Swear on your family. Tell him to strike you down dead if you breathe a word to anybody." I wasn't in a position to refuse him, and as much as I probably could have lunged for his rifle or something, I'm also not an idiot, so I didn't even consider that an option at the time. Instead, I just tried my best to ensure that he kept that sense of control, because the moment he lost it, the chances of me getting switched off increased exponentially. I swore on my whole extended family that I'd never, ever speak of our encounter for as long as I lived. I told him, and God, and anything else listening for that matter, that I would happily bury my loved ones if I broke my record and bond. And not just that, but I'd happily follow them to hell afterwards if I ever breathed a word of our encounter. I said just about anything and everything that came to mind, but once I really thought about my mom and dad and how devastated they'd be to hear about my body being found up there in that hill, that's when I felt myself starting to well up. I guess that's what really satisfied him in the end, seeing me get sort of emotional like that, not just scared, but sad or broken. Only then did he lower the rifle, and only then did he let me find my feet, and only then was I allowed to walk back down the hillside towards the trail. He yelled a reminder through the trees after me, reminding me of my promises, and so naturally, the first thing I did once I got some real cell phone signal was to report the entire goddamn thing in excruciating detail to the Beaverhead County Sheriff. Like I said, I'm not religious in the traditional sense, and even if I was, I wouldn't have let that guy manipulate my faith in such a way. This also isn't some made-up story where I'm going to keep the guy's secret, or one in which I'm so scared that he'll come after me that I remain silent. I'm willing to admit that I was terrified at the time. I was shaking like a leaf as I walked down that hill, but by the time I got back to my car, I was just about angrier than I'd ever been in my entire life. The mood I was in when I was pacing back and forth calling 911, I could have ended that mother effer 3 times over. But again, that would not have been the right play to make. The grown-up responsible thing to do would be to let the law enforcement handle it, and that's what I tried to do. The only trouble was, after about a week of haranguing the sheriff into dealing with our potential fugitive, I realized that nothing was being done regarding my complaint. First off, piles of red tape meant that the sheriff was forced to inform Beaverhead's contingent of forest rangers of the situation, who in turn took the task off his hands after ensuring him they'd be in touch regarding their search of the area. The day before I called the sheriff for a third time, the rangers had informed him that they'd been unable to locate any such cabin in the valley beneath Maverick Mountain. Naturally, I told the sheriff that was impossible, since I'd seen the cabin and its occupants with my own 2 eyes. I then went to the effort of providing him with, at least what I believe, are the exact coordinates denoting the cabin's location: 45 degrees, 28 minutes, 30.9 seconds north, and 113 degrees, 12 minutes, 41.1 seconds west. After that, the rangers promised to send out a second search party, and although this one actually found the guy's cabin, the man himself was nowhere to be found, and the structure appeared to have been unoccupied for quite some time. I was furious, to say the least. I have a lot of respect for people that choose to serve this country, no matter what form that service may take, but the ineptitude of the part of the authorities in allowing a dangerous fugitive to slip through their fingers is as staggering as it is frightening to me. I don't know for certain who I encountered up in Beaverhead that day, but I'd think that 90% of you would agree that the man was most probably some kind of criminal, and that in all likelihood, he was using that cabin and valley as cover to hide from law enforcement. That, or he was just kind of a psychopathic doomsday prepper who took pleasure in terrorizing just some kindly stranger. And either way, the idea of a second encounter filled me with a dread so intense, I'm not sure that I could put it into words. And that's why I haven't been back to Beaverhead since, and that if I did happen to visit those parts in the future, I'd stay the hell away from Maverick Mountain. Regardless of that sadistic old prick's motives, I guess he figured that I wasn't going to be true to my word because, as I said, when the Rangers finally did make it out to his cabin, the man who almost shot me was long gone. But that, in turn, takes me all the way back to the beginning of this email, when I said it wasn't so much a campfire story, but rather a grave warning to anyone planning on hiking in southwestern Montana, north of Idaho. I think that guy is just still out there, living off the grid. In fact, I'm certain of it. My only concern is that the next person who stumbles across him won't be as fortunate as I was. And rather than just being asked, "Do you believe in God?" I'm scared they'll be sent to meet him. I've been going on long-distance hikes in one form or another for just about as long as I can remember. My dad was an army vet, and his brother was always crazy into bow hunting, so most summers, myself, my father, my uncle, and my cousins would all head out into the woods south of Abbeville, South Carolina for a few days of hiking and camping. After he passed, I found that trips into the forest helped me feel closer to him, even if it was just a few hours of hiking on a Sunday afternoon. So at least once or twice a month, I'd gear up and then head out into the wilderness to burn off the stresses of everyday life. I was living down in Augusta when he died, and although there was a nice patch of woods out near Audubon's Bluff, I found the areas between Stevens Creek and the Hamilton Branch State Park to be much more like the woods that I'd hiked through as a child. Also, for accuracy's sake, I'm referring to Stevens Creek up in South Carolina, not the neighborhood in North Augusta, just in case anyone is confused. You could walk for miles and miles and not see anyone but the occasional fisherman. And so for about 90% of the time, it was just you, the creek, and the trees, peaceful and serene. But then one time, after driving up from Augusta on a Sunday afternoon, I was about 2 miles into my hike along Stevens Creek when I saw an odd shape in the woods off to my left. As you can imagine, I was used to seeing nothing but trees and the odd squirrel on the side of the creek, so seeing this big, dark lump caught my attention almost right away. I stopped in my tracks, turned to give it a good look over, and saw that someone had constructed a kind of makeshift shelter out of old dead wood by stacking it at an angle against a tree. I actually thought it was pretty cool at first. I mean, it had this slightly creepy, almost witchy vibe to it, but it was still kind of impressive to see that someone had been out there practicing survival skills or whatever. I carried on walking through the woods for another 5 or 10 minutes, then up ahead, I suddenly saw another one of those makeshift shelters. That one was a little bigger than the other, and someone had clearly put a lot more work into binding some of the larger pieces together so the whole thing didn't just collapse. I'd never seen anything like it on any of my previous hikes, and although they looked a little creepy, I wasn't worried about running into the person who constructed them. I mean, maybe one of the fishermen I saw sometimes brought their kids along the previous day, and they'd made the 2 shelters as a way of keeping themselves occupied while Dad tried to land a big one. But then, shortly after that thought crossed my mind, I spotted someone up ahead of me, working on one of the same shelters I'd just been looking at. As I got a little closer, I realized the guy looked to be in his 50s or 60s, around the same age as my dad when he passed. He had thinning gray hair pulled back into a ponytail, and he was overweight, and he wore an array of colorful hiking gear. As I approached, he saw me coming, so he stopped what he was doing for a moment, waved, and wished me a good afternoon. We talked for a little while about this and that, but long story short, he said that his name was Ron, and that he was pretty much doing exactly what it looked like, practicing the construction of impromptu shelters. He was actually doing so with the idea of camping out there one night, Just him, his shelter, and a canopy of stars above him. I joke that he might end up looking up at nothing but raindrops if he doesn't master his shelters before the fall, and then after we shared a few chuckles, I carried on with my hike. My usual routine was, once I'd reached the area near Hamilton Beach, I'd turn back on myself and then retrace my steps along the creek. I thought I might see Ron on the way back, but I didn't. He must have moved on by the time I got back to his shelters. I must have made 2 or 3 more trips to Stevens Creek that summer, and although I didn't see any more of Ron, I did see more of his handiwork. Every time I went for a hike, there would be 1 or 2 more shelters, some larger than the others, but always more skillfully constructed. It sometimes felt like me and Ron were engaged in a sort of wordless conversation. Every time I went for a hike, I'd get to see how much he'd improved at his rather strange but wholesome new hobby. I always hoped that I'd bump into him again, if only to find out how his survival camping adventure had gone. And that's why, during one particular hike in early September, I didn't feel frightened when I got the feeling that someone else was in the woods with me. I actually felt kind of excited. I recall walking through the woods, just parallel to the creek, and then quite literally hearing the snap of a stick behind me, which made me stop and turn my head. I figured it might be Ron, working away on a new shelter, so I turned back and started walking off in the direction I'd heard the sound. I walked for about a minute or two when I realized that Ron was nowhere to be seen. I stopped dead in my tracks and started back up again. If it wasn't him that had made the twig snap, then something else clearly had, and that something else might not be nearly so friendly. As I said, I backed up to my original path, then carried on walking along the creek via my usual route. I turned my head every so often to take a look behind me just to make sure no mountain lions or bears were following, but other than that, I stayed on my route. I always carried some bear mace and a pistol with me, like I'm not one of those people who very naively believe that bear mace is enough to keep you safe. I mean, aside from the fact that the odor will actually attract all the bears you didn't mace directly, it's not always just the wildlife you gotta be afraid of. And so by the time I'd reached the outskirts of Hamilton Branch, I was convinced that someone, or something, was stalking me through the woods. I'm not just saying that out of my misguided sense of paranoia either, nor had I managed to freak myself out by allowing my mind to play tricks on me. When a predatory animal is in your vicinity, everything goes deathly quiet. Birds don't sing, insects don't chirp. It's like every living thing hushes themselves into silence while some hungry killer slips through their midst. Like you know in the movies when someone says, "It's quiet, too quiet." That's exactly where it comes from, when everyone and everything is too scared to make a noise. So when I tell you that I knew something was following me that day, please don't think that I'm just some anxious person who can talk themselves into a tizzy. I know something was stalking me, and I know it 100%. I must have been about a half a mile from the Modoc trailhead when I stopped, took off my backpack, and then rummaged through it for the Taurus 856 that I always carried with me. Being a 38 special and a cool 16 ounces unloaded, it packs just enough punch to theoretically put down a wild animal, while being light enough to not be a literal burden wherever I carried one. It always gave me this residual feeling of safety, but that was the first time I'd ever gotten it out of my pack with the expectation of potentially using it. Yet I wasn't fearful of actually having to pull the trigger. I was fearful of what I might have to aim it at, be it a bear, a mountain lion, or one of my fellow human beings. I loaded it with a speed loader that I kept with me, so within just seconds of reaching into my pack, I was locked and loaded and ready to defend myself. After that, I just stood there for a few moments, watching the woods and the trail, just waiting to see if whatever had been following me was impatient enough to reveal itself. About a minute went by, then I found myself yelling off into the trees. "Ron? Is that you?" I guess that was nothing but wishful thinking on my part, just kind of hoping that Ron was, I don't know, maybe playing a trick on me or something. That would be creepy and inappropriate, but it sure as hell beat a wild animal or some other stranger stalking me through the woods. I stood in the same spot a little longer, then I don't know if I did this out of practicality or just to assuage my own nerves, but I called out something like, "If there's anyone following me, you better stop now. I'm armed, and I know how to use this thing. So y'all better stop before someone gets shot." But nothing moved, nothing stirred, but I could still feel eyes on me. At this point, I was faced with something of a conundrum. I could divert from my intended route, walk 2 miles into Modoc, and then walk in a big loop back on myself until I reached my car, which was parked down near Clark's Hill. Or I could save myself at least an hour's extra hike and walk back the way I came while remaining doubly vigilant and alert. Now, this was a Sunday, like I said, and back then, Sundays meant that I was on a pretty tight schedule. Not tight enough that I couldn't devote an entire hour for walking along the creek, but tight enough that I couldn't really afford to throw an extra 90 minutes to 2 hours onto my hike. Obviously, when it comes to personal and physical safety, an extra 2 hours is nothing. But I had my mace, I had my gun, and I had all my experience, the latter of which was telling me that, although there was a bad feeling in the air, I was still safe enough to walk back along the creek side, so long as I kept my wits about me. And so off I went. About halfway along the route, I see this pair of fly fishermen setting up at the edge of the creek. I said hi as I walked past, and then stopped and politely asked if they'd seen anyone else walking the trail as they'd hiked out to their spot. They told me yes, they had seen someone, but they were walking the opposite way, meaning that someone had 100% been behind me on the trail and had turned back at some point before I'd seen them. I asked what this person looked like, thinking that they might go on to describe Ron, but they didn't, and the person they ended up describing didn't sound like Ron at all. They also mentioned how after wishing the hiker a good afternoon, the fisherman didn't receive any kind of reply. Apparently, this hiker returned nothing but an awkward mumble and then carried on their business. The two fishermen then started asking why I'd seemed so concerned, and so I straight up told them that I was worried about someone following me. Not like an accident either, where they just so happened to be behind me on the trail. It was like someone was there and just didn't want to be seen. That's when the two fishermen shared these very nervous looks before telling me that the man that they'd seen was wearing camouflage, but didn't have any kind of hunting weapon with him and wasn't wearing any kind of safety orange jacket or anything like that. This hadn't given any pause for concern for me at first. I mean, people are entitled to walk through the woods wearing old army shoes, but in the context of me thinking that I'd been followed, they obviously found the detail as chilling as I did. As a precaution, I told the two fishermen where I was headed and where my car was parked, and then wished them a very pleasant afternoon and headed off. But on the drive back to Augusta, I couldn't help but wonder if they'd really been as innocent as I first expected. I guess this kinda does constitute paranoia on my part, but the idea that it was one of the fishermen that had been stalking me, only to back off when I started acting tough, that was somehow even creepier than anything else. Someone playing nice only to have sinister intentions, like someone out of a horror movie or whatever, it was enough to make my skin crawl, and I decided there and then that I'd give Stevens Creek a very wide berth for a while, at least for a month or two, so I could go back to see what progress Ron had made. Only that never happened, and I don't plan on ever going back to Stevens Creek, and the story of how that came to pass started with a phone call I received just a few weeks later. I just got home from work when I heard my phone ringing from inside my purse. I didn't recognize the number, and assuming it was a sales call, I almost hit the red button to decline it. But then, I don't know, it was like something in my head just said, answer it. And when I did, I heard it was a deputy calling from the McCormick County Sheriff's Department up in South Carolina. My first thought was that I'd committed some kind of traffic violation or something around Clark's Hill, which was usually where I parked my car whenever I went hiking around Stevens Creek. But the call was not about any kind of traffic violation. The call was about my friend Ron. The deputy didn't refer to Ron as Ron, not at first anyway. He simply asked if I'd ever encountered an individual building survival shelters up near Stevens Creek. This deputy had already spoken to the fishermen that I'd bumped into on the day that I'd been stalked, which was how they'd traced me to Clark's Hill via a security camera which watched the parking lot that I'd used. The fisherman must have mentioned that I was a regular hiker there, which ended up making me a potential witness for something I was yet to be informed of. My first thoughts were that Ron had gotten hurt somehow, or had maybe gone missing, so I was very forthright about my interaction with him. But then the deputy made some allusion to human remains being found out near the creek, and I felt my heart slowly sinking into my chest. I remember this feeling of absolute horror, thinking the same thing that had stalked me had gotten Ron instead. He must have been working away on one of his shelters, completely oblivious to the woods around them, and then bam, the most painful death you can imagine, without a soul around to ever hear him die. I remember asking if it was an animal attack, if they found Ron, if he had any family. But there wasn't much the deputy was willing to tell me at that stage, and to be honest, I'm still uncomfortably ignorant on what actually happened out there. That being said, this is what I do know. There wasn't just one set of human remains found out there. There were two, and neither of them belonged to anyone called Ron. Then, seeing as the two bodies were found in one of the shelters out there by Stevens Creek, the person calling themselves Ron was in fact the case's #1 suspect. On the insistence of the deputy, this prompted me to search my memory for any instance of Ron mentioning places or people or things, just about anything they could use to pin down his whereabouts. I had nothing. Our exchange had been brief and unexciting, so with regret I informed the deputy that I could no longer really assist them. And that was literally the last thing I had heard about the bodies that were found out near the creek. Every so often, in the years that have passed, I've searched the web in the hopes of finding something, anything to help enlighten me on what exactly happened out there. But every time I've tried to practice the not-so-ancient art of Google Foo, as I've heard it referred to, I've come up short. I think I'm just fishing for details, pieces of information to fill in the blanks, but deep down, I think I understand what happened to me that day up by Stevens Creek. I think I narrowly avoided falling victim to someone terrible. Not a bear or a mountain lion, a man. And I think someone was walking the woods that day when I got that creepy feeling, someone who ended up making victims out of two innocent people. And I think only by the grace of God did I avoid that very same fate. Way back in May of 1995, a 29-year-old truck driver named Devin Eugene Williams was living in Americus, Kansas with his wife and 3 young children. Having just moved into a brand new family home, Devin's wife would later say it was the happiest point in their marriage. But beneath the surface, something terrible festered and unfurled. Devin was described by friends as a patient and good-natured young man, but just weeks after beginning an exciting new chapter in his life, he disappeared without a trace. On Sunday, May 28th of 1995, a 48-foot, 10-ton, 18-wheeler semi-truck hurtled through Arizona's Tonto National Forest. The roar of its engine was so loud that 2 campers, named Lynn and Jack Yarrington, temporarily halted their hike to see what all the commotion was. They approached the nearest highway, then seconds later, spotted a speeding 18-wheeler recklessly careening back and forth along a stretch of road it was most certainly not suited for, and all at breakneck speed so fast it sent a shiver down the Yarrington spines. Another group of hikers, this one traveling by car, suffered a hair-raisingly close call when the same 18-wheeler drove head-on at them, following a chance encounter on the highway. The hikers were able to swerve out of the truck's path, and each avoided sudden and violent deaths, but later stated that the truck's mustachioed driver had remained disturbingly expressionless despite narrowly avoiding his own complete annihilation. Later on that day, a group on their way to a picnic spotted the stationary truck, which by that point had swerved off the road and become stuck in a field. After stopping their vehicle, one of the picnic group climbed out of their car and asked the truck driver if he needed any help. The driver's reply was as chilling as it was confusing. "They made me do it," he said, as if answering a question that hadn't been asked. The Good Samaritan, a man named Charles Hall, reportedly asked the truck driver, "Who made you do what?" To which the driver replied in a panicked voice, "No, you can't help. No one can. I'll never get it out of there. I'm going to jail." When Charles heard the word jail being thrown around, he realized that he might have stumbled across something deeply sinister. He agreed to leave the truck driver alone, but later contacted the local sheriff's department, speaking to a Deputy Wells regarding the man's suspicious demeanor. Much like the campers, the deputy was confused as to why such a large vehicle would drive along unsuitable forest roads and went to investigate. Upon his arrival, he discovered the semi stuck in deep mud within a meadow not far from Forest Service Road 137 in the Buck Springs area. Once Deputy Wells looked inside the truck, he discovered the cargo within undisturbed and intact, 1,200 boxes of lettuce and strawberries with the refrigeration still running. The vehicle appeared completely abandoned and the cab had been firmly locked. Deputy Wells checked his national crime computer and learned that there were no reports submitted for either a missing truck or a missing driver. He also later stated, upon peering through the window of the truck's cab, he noted the interior was well kept and there was no indication that any foul play had taken place. Later that day, Lynn and Jack Yarrington were driving along Forest Service Road 321